Welcome to this session. My name is Paul Miller, and I am the chair of this session. And I am pleased to welcome you to listen to our keynote speaker and to share in some reflections with him. Colleagues, indulge me a minute, please. I want to make the point that BERA has, for the last decade, been putting great emphasis on equity, diversity, and inclusion in its work as an organization, in also its choice of speakers, the panelists, the diversity of topics that are presented at conference and keynotes. And so this keynote is a continuation of that unequivocal and careful investment in this area of scholarship. Why is this important? This is important because BERA recognizes that we are affected as people by different things, and we have different things shaping our experiences of institutions, and also as a society, different pressures on us, whether these issues are around religion, gender, ethnicity, age, special education needs, disability, or indeed wars in Ukraine, in Gaza, in Yemen, in Haiti, in Afghanistan, or other parts of the world. BERA recognizes that these things matter to you, to me, to each of us, and BERA isn't afraid to surface these tensions and these contradictions in choice of speakers and also these topics that it brings forward for discussion. So BERA then is confronting the social issues and the social justice issues of the day. Tim's speech will take us further by debating issues around free speech and academic freedom and institutional advocacy and institutional neutrality and culture wars, including discussions around the far right. And we have seen recent racist and Islamophobic protests in the UK. So let me just say a word about our speaker. Professor Tim Soutphommasane is Chief Diversity Officer at the University of Oxford and Professor of Practice in Human Rights and Political Theory. He is previously Director of Culture and Strategy at the University of Sydney in Australia and Australia's Race Discrimination Commissioner. As a commissioner, he led Australia's national efforts in combating racial discrimination during a period of extensive debate around race, rights, and freedom of speech. His work and commentary has appeared on the BBC, on CNN, on the New York Times, The Guardian, and so on. He is author of 5 books. One of them, I Am Not Racist, But. The other one, Don't Go Back to Where You Came From, The Virtuous Citizen, and Reclaiming Patriotism. Colleagues all, please help me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Professor Tim Soutphommasane.
Colleagues, delighted to be joining you, and can I begin by thanking BERA for its commitment to facilitating conversations around questions of social justice and equity, and I look forward to continuing that conversation in the 90 minutes or so that we have this afternoon. Only a few years ago, it seemed that diversity and inclusion were on an emphatic march. Amid the protests of Black Lives Matter in particular, triggered by the murder of George Floyd in 2020, many organisations and leaders rushed to take action. Within the corporate world, many CEOs and boards embraced diversity and inclusion schemes. Almost 70% of British companies have embarked on initiatives to address racism in the workplace since 2020. In the United States alone, corporations pledged $50 billion on racial equity initiatives, including donations to civil rights organisations and overhauling recruitment and training. By 2022, 3/4 of the S&P 500 in the US had a chief diversity officer, and more than 2/5 had set targets to increase the racial diversity of their workforce. Well, it now feels that we've reached the high watermark of that activity. According to The Guardian columnist Nesreen Malik, if 2020 was the year that Black Lives Matter went mainstream, 2024 was the year it died. And I quote, "Quietly, without even the customary whimper, the trappings of diversity so frantically sought and flamboyantly brandished after those protests 4 years ago are being discarded." That might be putting things maybe a bit too melodramatically. But the evidence does point to a very different environment, and I dare say to how the tide has receded. Many large organisations are now unwinding their diversity and inclusion commitments, as well as cutting staff, budgets and programs connected to diversity. A recent survey of more than 100 global leaders of large organisations found that diversity and inclusion initiatives had fallen from executives' lists of top priorities. It's been reported that the rate of attrition for diversity, equity and inclusion positions has been about double that of other roles, with EDI or DEI executives reporting more hostility towards their work and unsupportive environments. If we for a moment just cast our gaze across the Atlantic to the US, we can see in recent times there have been successful pushes by activists to compel companies to reverse their stances on DEI. I'm going to switch, by the way, in referring to DEI and EDI, DEI being primarily the American designation. I'm aware that EDI and DEI are used here in the UK. There may be other nomenclature used elsewhere. D&I, for example, in Australia is still fairly common. But to give you some examples of recent experience, the coffee company Starbucks, the tractor maker John Deere & Co., motorcycle maker Harley Davidson, home improvement retailer Lowe's, the automaker Ford, and just last week, the brewer Molson Coors have all announced that they would end some diversity work after being targeted for consumer boycotts. That is to say nothing, of course, of how the issue has been playing out within American universities. I'm sure there are some American colleagues here who can shed light on that. For decades, many American universities have given special consideration to minority students in a bid to address long-standing inequities, particularly those students from Black, Hispanic and Native American backgrounds. But last June, the US Supreme Court held that affirmative action in university admissions was unconstitutional, prompting scores of lawsuits challenging the legality of DEI policies. These lawsuits have focused variously on targeted workplace and government programs meant for specific groups that have been underrepresented. Some of those I've mentioned already. And then there's been the fallout from campus protests sparked by the Israel-Hamas war. As we all know, numerous American universities have been entangled in controversy about their response to anti-Semitism. The presidents of Harvard, Penn, and Columbia have notably resigned from their offices. But in particular, the resignation of Harvard's former president, Claudine Gay, has become viewed as totemic of the state of DEI. Following her appearance at a US congressional hearing about anti-Semitism in Congress, on campuses, Gay became the target of a concerted campaign from conservative and other activists, which led to investigations into her academic work, which found examples of sloppy citations, in her critics' eyes, examples of plagiarism. Gay's critics would present her as an archetypal example of DEI gone wrong. In their account, an example of how zealously implemented DEI agendas end up placing ill-qualified people into positions of leadership by virtue of their race or gender or both. As one US critic of DEI explained, Gay's fall from grace was not only a reflection of DEI excess, but also should galvanise efforts to unwind DEI from other universities and organisations. Let me quote. "The same public campaign that ousted Claudine Gay now needs to turn its attention to the policies and practices that allowed her to become Harvard president and produce enough disastrous publicity to force her removal. We need to dismantle DEI bureaucracies and uproot the ideology they promote on campus. We need to re-establish high and consistent standards for academic research. This would almost certainly require the elimination of academic departments that are characterised more by political advocacy than rigorous inquiry, such as ethnic and gender studies departments." Fighting words, if I ever heard them. Underpinning this has been a certain view or understanding of DEI, one with which many of us in this room may disagree, I suspect, but which nonetheless is consistent or genuinely held by those critical of efforts, institutional efforts, around diversity. I know you've all heard it before, but let's just for a brief moment rehearse very quickly some of the language that is used by DEI's critics. Here's Jay Green of the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank in the US. "Bloated DEI bureaucracies continue to promote the discriminatory ideology that people deserve different treatment depending upon the racial, ethnic, or sexual identities that place them in oppressor or oppressed categories. Standards for research integrity continue to weaken and be upheld differently depending on the preferred status of researchers and their findings." Here's Jay Slater, the editor of Spiked, who refers to DEI as, and I quote, "An ideology that, like so many of the most malignant ideologies today, is presented as something only a monster could oppose. In truth, while dolled up in the language of anti-racism, DEI represents a divisive, racialized worldview and a corresponding set of policies that has taken hold in higher education, corporate capitalism, and the state. Roughly speaking, it amounts to the institutionalization of left identity politics and all the ugly things that come with it. Concepts of permanent black victimhood and permanent white guilt, racial discrimination revived in progressive garb, and an authoritarian bureaucracy to punish wrongthink and protect minorities from anything that might offend their allegedly delicate sensibilities." And finally, I'm about to end, here's Bill Ackman, venture capitalist and one of the primary agitators behind Claudine Gay's departure from Harvard, who says DEI is a political advocacy movement on behalf of certain groups that are deemed oppressed under DEI's own methodology. Under DEI, one's degree of oppression is determined based upon where one resides on a so-called intersectional pyramid of oppression where whites, Jews, and Asians are deemed oppressors, and a subset of people of colour, LGBTQ people, and all women are deemed to be oppressed. Under DEI's ideology, any policy, program, educational system, economic system, grading system, admission policy, and even climate change due to its disparate impact on geographies and the people that live there, etc., leads to unequal outcomes among people of different skin colours is deemed racist. As a result, according to DEI, capitalism is racist, advanced placement exams are racist, IQ tests are racist, corporations are racist, or in any other words, any merit-based program, system, or organisation which has or generates outcomes for different races that are at variance with the proportion these different races represent in the population at large is by definition racist under DEI's ideology. Now, the UK is not the US, though debates there certainly influence developments here. And these, I should add, are observations of a relatively newcomer or someone who's recently returned to the UK. There have been instances when US-style culture wars, to be sure, have shaped British experience, including in the educational realm. For example, in 2022, the UK government issued guidance to teachers about Black Lives Matter, in which it warned educators not to promote partisan political views associated with BLM, which, and I quote, go beyond the basic shared principle that racism is unacceptable. In May, earlier this year, the then Government Minister Esther McVey, better known as the Minister for Common Sense within the Cabinet Office, announced that there would be a crackdown on diversity initiatives in the UK civil service, including the banning of rainbow lanyards, restrictions on external diversity spending, and abolition of staff networks such as those for Muslim or LGBTQ+ staff. In October 2023, the then Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology, Michelle Donnellan, wrote an open letter criticising comments from members of UKRI's Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Group. UKRI is UK Research and Innovation for colleagues who are unfamiliar, regarding the Israel-Hamas war, which prompted the CEO of UKRI to suspend the advisory group, launch an investigation, as well as carry out a review about the future of advisory structures in UKRI. By the way, in March earlier this year, UKRI said its investigation found no evidence of a breach of the EDI advisory group's terms of reference or the Nolan principles, which cover standards in public life. However, the chair of the advisory group and other members resigned. That's some scene setting. But all this does raise, in my view, a number of questions. While on the face of things, the UK debate has tended to be less sharply polarised than that of the US, there have clearly been flashpoints. But to what extent does the state of the British conversation resemble that of the American conversation? Although, as we appreciate, experiences here will be shaped inevitably by global exchanges and transatlantic exchanges, to what extent must the British conversation be guided by its own particular context? This is what I intend to explore with you in some further depth this afternoon. And in what follows, I'll be sharing and outlining with you some recent research that colleagues and I at Oxford, at UCL, and More in Common, which is a think tank that studies public opinion, have done on British public opinion on equality, diversity and inclusion. I will highlight some of the salient themes that have emerged from that research, and I want to reflect in particular on the relationship, as Paul mentioned, between EDI and free speech, and on the challenge that I see emerging tied to debates about institutional neutrality and partisanship within universities. In short, while there is clearly a highly polarised environment that has shaped public debates about diversity and inclusion, we must be careful not to import US-style culture wars into the British context, or indeed elsewhere. The evidence, as I will outline, suggests that British public sentiment on EDI should, if anything, give us confidence to craft institutional or organisational responses to diversity and inclusion that avoid some of the conflicts that have defined recent American experience. So with that, let me jump into the research that I have mentioned. This was released in March earlier this year in a report called Finding a Balance. And what we wanted to investigate was just how reality resembled, if at all, some of the public and media debates that we see and hear on diversity and equality. What do the British public actually think about EDI? And what do they think about the efficacy of EDI initiatives within organisations? These were the basic questions that animated our study. What we did was we surveyed 6,000 people across the UK, excluding Northern Ireland. We also supplemented the surveys with focus groups that were conducted in Sunderland, Bristol and Derby. And we did this in order to reflect on how we could build and maintain sustainable support for EDI in a time of intense polarisation. Before I go into the details of the findings, we drew upon the segmentation methodology that our partners More in Common use in the research. And what they have done is segment the British population into 7 ideological segments based on profiles they build, drawing upon people's responses to questions about identity and loyalty, threat perception, views of parenting and authority. They've done this to build something of a psychological profile of the electorate or of the British public. And you'll see from left to right, 7 roughly segments of roughly equal size, anything between 10 to about 18% of the population. Progressive activists, many of these labels are perhaps self-explanatory. Progressive activists are a segment for whom politics is central to their personal identity. These are people who follow debates very closely and who are very self-consciously progressive in their political inclination. Activists, many social justice activists would probably belong in this segment. Civic pragmatists are largely community-minded people who do not like the divisiveness in contemporary politics, but who are engaged in public events. Disengaged battlers, on the other hand, are not engaged in public affairs or follow the news very closely and are more concerned with their day-to-day battles and with day-to-day preoccupations. Established liberals are what could be labelled pejoratively or otherwise as the metropolitan elite. These are people who are relatively comfortable in their lives, who are cosmopolitan in their orientation. Loyal nationals are those who are closely identified with the hitherto red war that existed within British politics. So people who had a strong identification with the nation, who saw threats to national identity but have a strong sense of fairness. Disengaged traditionalists are those with conservative inclinations but who don't really follow political developments all that closely. And backbone conservatives are probably self-explanatory as a segment here. This was interesting for us because it helped to draw out outliers within opinion when it came to equality, diversity and inclusion, and we'll come to that very shortly. Before I come to this, the headline finding for us was around people's general feeling or sentiment towards EDI. We asked people, do you believe that EDI is a good or a bad thing? We found that 62% of the British public believed that EDI was a good thing. 62%. 12% believed it was a bad thing. So, according to our findings, Britons are 5 times more likely to believe that EDI is good rather than bad. That's the headline finding, which I think should give some assurance about where mainstream opinion on these matters really lies. But then we broke this down and asked people very specifically about how they felt about EDI work, for example, whether they believed that initiatives on EDI led to fairer outcomes. We found overall that 46% agreed that work around DEI or EDI leads to fairer outcomes, with 28% believing it leads to more unfair outcomes. And here's where it starts getting interesting. If you go through the segmentations, you will see some variances emerging. So your progressive activists obviously are way out there, with 4/5 believing it leads to fairer outcomes. Backbone conservatives, disengaged traditionalists rather, are your most sceptical with loyal nationals and established liberals closely following them. We then asked the British public about whether they thought EDI was good for them. So are EDI initiatives good for people like me? Overall, 43% of people agreed. Again, progressive activists are very enthusiastic about EDI, with disengaged traditionalists the most sceptical. But note here the pattern that's starting to emerge, that apart from one or two outlier segments, you're seeing a fairly consistent cluster of sentiment across British society. We also segmented this, by the way, in looking at people's backgrounds in particular. So you will see there the differences in sex and some variations based on racial background, with white British people, 39% of white British people believing that EDI initiatives are good for them, compared to 60% of Asian British who believe that, compared to 70% of black British who believe that. Probably doesn't surprise many of us, I suspect, that you would see patterns like this. But we wanted to dig a bit deeper and think about the cultural elements of EDI as well. We know that there is a lot of debate about people being cancelled for doing or saying the wrong things about diversity. Well, we investigated this. We asked people, do you believe that people are made to feel stupid for not understanding the latest way to talk about diversity issues? 3/4, or close to 3/4, of those we surveyed said that they often, or that they believe that people are often or sometimes made to feel stupid for not knowing how to talk about diversity the right way. Even, by the way, even a majority, by the way, progressive activists would agree with that too. But if you look at backbone conservatives there at the bottom, or you look at disengaged battlers, you're seeing there a very consistent picture. Do people worry about saying the wrong thing themselves? Half of those we surveyed said that they either often or sometimes worried about saying the wrong thing on diversity issues. Fairly consistent here throughout all of the ideological segments. Here's an interesting one. Is it helpful to criticise people for making mistakes on diversity issues in order for them to learn from them? This is one of the questions where we see progressive activists representing an outlier of public opinion. So 29% of those we surveyed believed that it was helpful to criticise people in order to help them. 55% disagreed, but there was only one group, or there was one group who had a majority view in agreement on this, and that was the progressive activists. An outlier, a clear outlier compared to other segments. Is woke helpful as a term? We know that woke is often used as a shorthand for diversity. We were surprised by this, finding that only 1/4 of people believe that terms like woke were in fact helpful in understanding and resolving issues of discrimination and disadvantage. We're very keen for members of our media class to pick up on this finding, given their likeness for the term. But again, consistent throughout all of the segments here. I hope you can see that there's a picture building here of relative consistency on many of the questions we're asking across segments that would otherwise disagree, or be depicted as disagreeing on these very issues. What about framing, though? Does framing affect how people think about EDI? We asked on the left, or we asked for responses on the left to this. The term white privilege is useful because it helps to understand the advantages that white people can sometimes have over those from ethnic minority communities. What we found was that 6 of the 7 segments did not believe that the term white privilege was useful, the exception there being progressive activists. But when we flipped the question, as it were, and asked people for responses to the following statement, that there are still areas of British life where those from ethnic minority communities experience discrimination compared to those who are white, all 7 segments agreed, albeit to varying degrees. We would draw from this a sense of how framing, the language you use and how you depict issues can go a long way to generating openness or a response to dialogue. What about hate speech and free speech then? I mean, there's such a great deal of attention devoted to questions of free speech and hate speech. This was perhaps one of the areas that we investigated where there was some division or polarization, in particular on whether people believed it was more important to protect people from hate speech than it was to protect them from free speech. 40% of people believed that, but 42% believed it was more important to protect free speech than it is to protect people from hate speech. We use this question, by the way, because when we asked another question about whether it was important to allow free speech to prevail over people feeling offended, there was majority support for that proposition. But when you, again, this is a lesson perhaps in framing, when you framed it not in terms of offence, but in terms of hate speech, you got a very different response. Is free speech under threat then? This surprised us. Majority of those we surveyed, and every group, with one exception, felt that free speech was under threat. The only group that didn't agree with that proposition were your comfortable, established liberals, perhaps because they're the ones who never have to worry about having a platform or not getting heard themselves in various forms. At least that's the interpretation we would take to that. But progressive activists and backbone conservatives alike feel that free speech is under threat, perhaps for somewhat different reasons. Here's one for you as educators or as researchers with an interest in education. Should students be exposed to a range of views in university? Across the board, 73% agree that it's important that students are exposed to a range of different views. All segments showed majority support for this, with one although there was one segment that was less enthusiastic, which is your disengaged traditionalists who aren't as enthusiastic about students being exposed to a range of views in university. I'm almost coming to the end here, but I just wanted to go through the range of findings just to give you a fair sense of what we dug into and what we found. We did ask people about no platforming, namely preventing people from taking part in a debate or meeting due to them holding certain views that are deemed unacceptable. We gave a number of examples to test whether people believed it would be appropriate to no platform someone. So we asked them, do you believe no platforming is acceptable for someone who incites racial hatred? And there we found strong support for no platforming someone who would incite racial hatred. This garnered the strongest affirmative response. There was a positive net response too with respect to people who argue that certain races are less intelligent than others, and people who dispute that the Holocaust happened. But then we found net negative responses, and that is to say that people did not believe that no platforming should occur with respect to people who hold the following views, and they are someone who argues that trans women shouldn't be able to take part in women-only sports, someone who argues that men and women have different roles in society, someone who wants to abolish the monarchy, and someone with left-wing or right-wing views. So I think an interesting portrait there of what people believe are the acceptable bounds of debate at the moment within British society. Here's an interesting one. Paul mentioned institutional advocacy, and I'm going to be reflecting on this in a bit more detail shortly. But we asked people, is it appropriate for a business or university or police force to do the following? Organise a remembrance service, condemn, and this was done in November, by the way, last year, condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, condemn Hamas's attack on Israel, hold a pride event, condemn Israel's bombing of Gaza, support Black Lives Matter protests, promote trans rights, endorse a political party. And for those of you who have a particular interest in how people responded to universities, you'll it may be difficult for you to make out on screen, but the grey circle is what denotes universities, business is in red, police in blue. But what you can see there generally is a sense that people believe that an institution like police should have the least leeway or freedom to be taking institutional positions on issues. Businesses seem, on many of the questions, to have, in the public's view, more legitimate freedom to advocate, with universities in the middle there. But if you look at the net scores, it appears that people that we surveyed believe that universities could legitimately organise a remembrance service, condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, condemn Hamas's attack on Israel, and hold a pride event. They were more sceptical around condemning Israel's bombing of Gaza. There was net appropriateness around Black Lives Matter protests and supporting that, but only just. Endorsing a political party was considered beyond the pale for all major institutions. Should institutions then be spending more time taking part in EDI debates? We asked this with respect to a number of institutions, universities among them, and you'll see universities there listed fourth down. Note the finely poised public view on whether universities should be spending more time taking part in EDI debates. 40% agree, 40% disagree. And what should we do with historic monuments related with slavery? We know, of course, that in recent years there's been considerable debate about how to treat historic monuments or artefacts that were either funded by the proceeds of slavery or which celebrate aspects of the history of the slave trade. 8% overall believed that we should pull such monuments down, with a slight majority believing that we should keep them but provide an explanation for visitors about how they came about, with 27% believing that nothing should be done. What's striking here, again, is just how consistent it is across those ideological segments. So your progressive activists are not far off your loyal nationals with respect to whether historic monuments associated with slavery should be pulled down. Really interesting, and one that surprised us a little. So how do we make sense of all of this? In the report that we generated, we did reflect on what we believed could be the way forward for a renewal of EDI or DEI initiatives informed by these findings. I'm just going to go through them very briefly. One is that EDI activities need to be tailored to particular institutions or employers, that it's critical for EDI to be relevant to people's day-to-day work or experience within the particular institution. We believe it's important that we take from this a focus on people, not concepts. To some extent, this is about how you frame EDI work. If it's about doctrinal understanding of issues, you're likely to get a very different response to explaining that this is about how your colleagues or your neighbours or your fellow students might feel around you. Which then links to our next recommendation around how it's critical to try our best to build a culture of curiosity and generosity, and not a default culture of criticism. This isn't to say that there are instances and certain forms of behaviour or conduct which must unapologetically be criticised or called out. But if we're talking about how we interact with one another within organisations or institutions, the default should be a culture of curiosity and generosity. We should distinguish between what people do inside a workplace or institution and what they do in their private lives. This is a distinction, as we all know, that is difficult to maintain in an age when public bleeds into the private. We also believe that it's important not to reject merit. Very often EDI or DEI is presented in opposition or as a critique of merit. One way of understanding EDI would be that it removes barriers from the realisation of a meritocratic ideal properly understood. I've mentioned this already, but having inclusive framings around these issues is critical, and we were given encouragement by just how strong the endorsement of EDI was among more conservative segments. So there's no reason to assume that people are inherently hostile towards diversity, so avoiding an us and them view would be helpful. Think also about your messengers and your coalitions. I noted at various points just how progressive activists represent a clear outlier of opinion within British society, but it's more often than not progressive activists who are the ones in charge of activities relating to EDI. So there's a serious question about how you get the right messengers to take the proposition forward and how you build coalitions that aren't confined to one segment or outlier within British society. We believe that and recommend that you think of EDI and free speech as going hand in hand. I'm going to reflect on this a bit more within the academic context. I think it is possible to embrace free speech but also reject hate speech and discrimination. It doesn't mean that there's going to be a clear answer on each and every instance, but it should be possible, it must be possible, surely, to be committed to free speech as well as condemn bigotry and hatred. Where possible, there seems to be strong consensus for taking the approach of retaining and explaining, so we can take the time to explain historic injustices and historic mistreatment of people. But it is clear that Britons favour an approach that provides a warts and all understanding of history. And then finally, and again I'll elaborate on this a bit more very shortly, know when to intervene. It's clear from the questions we asked about institutional advocacy that the British public responds very differently to organisations when they advocate within the bounds of their institutional mission as opposed to stepping outside that institutional mission. Okay. Let me then reflect on two aspects that have been generated by some of these findings. And I want to turn in more detail now to the relationship between EDI and free speech, particularly within the university setting. As you've seen from the survey that we conducted, there is very strong support for the idea that universities must expose students to a range of views, including strong support from those who are progressively minded. Often though, as I've said, it can seem as though free speech and EDI exist in conflict, or at least in some serious or fundamental tension, at least if you judge from the many discussions about this. But I would say that it's important that we provide a robust statement of how properly understood the commitments to free speech and commitments to EDI go hand in hand. If I can speak momentarily of our experience at the University of Oxford, this has been something that we have certainly sought to emphasise over the past 18 months. We have an institutional statement on free speech at Oxford where we commit ourselves to allowing all lawful speech that members of our community deem relevant to be given the chance of a fair hearing. We encourage robust civility, and we believe that views must be subject to questioning, scrutiny, and also lawful protests, but we do not believe in censoring lawfully expressed views. This, I believe, is entirely consistent with having a concern with equality and diversity. Namely, we should ensure that the voices of minoritised groups are also given the chance to be heard. Discussion about issues should not and must not lead to people experiencing bullying, harassment, discrimination, or victimisation. But in all of this, I think we can say that we must also be live to the nuances of power We can't be indifferent to the power of speech itself. Quite often we hear of people's responses to debates in terms of being cancelled or there being a cancel culture. This is not helpful in the same way that I think woke is not helpful as a description. My colleague at Oxford, Amiya Srinivasan, recently wrote in the London Review of Books that when people do speak out against something, particularly those who are not in positions of power, we must resist characterising it as a desire to cancel others. And let me quote her momentarily. "No doubt it can be painful, infuriating or upsetting to be called a racist or a bigot or a sexist or a transphobe. Most of us would find it horrible to be told that we aren't worth engaging with, that our views are socially unacceptable or merely a function of demography. But that it is painful to be on the receiving end of such remarks doesn't mean that one's own rights to free speech are thereby imperiled. It might simply be a reminder that speech can wound." I think that's a sobering reminder. I think often when people say, "you are cancelling me," what they really mean to say is, "you disagree with me." It's as simple as that. But words can wound, speech can damage, speech can also be formative. As a political theorist, I'm naturally very acute to mentions of political theorists in public discourse, but the writings of John Stuart Mill are often invoked within discussions of free speech. According to Mill, and this is an off-cited passage of his, "There ought to exist the fullest liberty of professing and discussing as a matter of conviction any doctrine, however immoral it may be considered." Even for a defender of free speech such as Mill, though, the defence of liberty was always concerned with more than just a right to say what you wanted for the sake of it. In the case of Mill, free speech mattered because it enabled the discovery of truth and because it was necessary for self-realisation. Speech, in other words, matters, at least in part, because it helps enable people to express their individuality, which is why in any debate we must be prepared not just to hear from those whose voice is louder or stronger. And that's where I think the connection between free speech and EDI lies. In a recent analysis, the philosopher Robert Simpson has explained it another way. He says that we can articulate the alignment between academic freedom and free speech and EDI more clearly. As he puts it, we can in very general terms conceive of two functions of a university. First, universities have an epistemic mission, which he describes as collective inquiry. Namely, they produce knowledge and generate related benefits such as expertise, understanding, skills, and data. This is how we would typically understand the mission of a university when we conventionally describe the work that we do in universities as being about research, teaching, and the advancement of learning and knowledge. Second, though, universities have a civic mission. They foster a particular kind of socio-cultural ethos, or as Simpson puts it, by placing their participants in a social environment where the diversity and depth of human understanding is particularly evident. You might say, in addition, universities are typically understood to be institutions that exist to serve a common good, or something resembling that, to contribute to social, cultural, economic, and other forms of collective well-being. If you view it in this way, though, academic freedom and free speech and EDI may appear to rest on separate ethical foundations. Whereas academic freedom and free speech clearly serve the epistemic part of the university's mission in enabling discovery of knowledge, EDI clearly serves the civic aspects of a university's mission. But I think that'd be too simple, and as Simpson argues, it is also possible to understand how EDI supports the epistemic mission of a university in a number of respects. It seems right to suggest, for example, that there's a fundamental alignment between free speech and EDI in the following way. universities, and I quote, generally do better at collective inquiry and by implication better fulfill the epistemic part of their mission when they are most egalitarian, more inclusive, and more diverse. If I can just for a moment go through in further detail the arguments that Simpson constructs here, because I think it does help to give you some of the nuance around how we can construct an argument for the alignment between EDI and free speech. First, Simpson says there's an aptitude argument, what he calls the aptitude argument, relating to the acquisition of knowledge via research. Put simply, a university can't function at its best if it isn't open to everyone, because it can't then effectively tap into society's pool of talented students and researchers. Absent any good reason to think that the aptitudes that lend themselves to research excellence are disproportionately found in a particular sex, race, religion, class, or background, EDI must surely help to advance universities' epistemic mission by removing barriers to researchers from marginalised or underrepresented backgrounds to acquire the relevant credentials and work opportunities. That's argument one. Second argument is called the perspective argument, and this relates to the knowledge acquisition aspect of collective inquiry. This recognises how life experiences can affect the starting points that people bring to their research, as I'm sure it has in many of our experiences. What strikes us as good questions or problems to explore will often reflect people's backgrounds or upbringing. Other things being equal, though a greater level of homogeneity in the demographic makeup of researchers would seem likely to correlate with a higher degree of homogeneity in people's life experiences, and thus the starting points that shape their contributions to collective inquiry. This is about broadening, if you will, the researcher gene pool. If you remove prejudicial barriers to entry, you can, through, in this respect, help promote the aims of collective inquiry. Finally, the third argument, the epistemic bubble argument, is what Simpson calls it. This relates to the knowledge dissemination part of collective inquiry. Epistemic bubbles, according to Simpson, are social networks where there is widespread false belief due to a lack of exposure to relevant counter-evidence or alternative viewpoints. Where such bubbles do exist, they impede the efficient dissemination of knowledge. If we accept this, then a stance of EDI can be justified then insofar as it helps break down epistemic bubbles that may exist among identity groups that are relatively underrepresented or marginalised within higher education. They're the three arguments that Simpson puts on the case for an alignment between EDI and free speech. Let me now attempt a conclusion. If we accept that EDI and free speech concerns can rightly be aligned, what must then be the limits for universities' efforts on EDI? If we take the view that EDI is an activity that is aligned with the core mission of universities in advancing knowledge through research and teaching, does that mean that EDI can only be conducted insofar as it exists within universities' core mission? Does that mean that universities cannot adopt a more expansive view of EDI or advocate on matters of diversity that may sit outside the arena of education? These are, right now, live questions for many of us within higher education. Amid the debates about DEI in the US, there's been a concerted push for the establishment of institutional neutrality as the guiding approach to how universities conduct their engagement with public debates. And I'd like to conclude by reflecting very briefly on this. I perhaps won't give you an entirely satisfactory answer, but sometimes asking the question is just as important as providing an answer. But what is this doctrine of institutional neutrality, and is it compatible with the view of EDI that I've outlined? The idea of institutional neutrality for universities is, of course, closely associated with the Calvin Report of 1967 in the US. named after a professor in the University of Chicago School of Law. The report emerged amid student unrest relating to demands that the university divest from companies linked to apartheid South Africa, and was also related to the Vietnam War draft. But here's what the committee said in defining what the mission of a university was. And I quote, "The mission of the university is the discovery, improvement, and dissemination of knowledge. Its domain of inquiry and scrutiny includes all aspects and all values of society. A university faithful to its mission will provide enduring challenges to social values, policies, practices, and institutions. By design and by effect, it is the institution which creates discontent with the existing social arrangements and proposes new ones. In brief, a good university, like Socrates, will be upsetting." The committee concluded, "A university, if it is to be true to its faith in intellectual inquiry, must embrace, be hospitable to, and encourage the widest diversity of views within its own community. It is a community, but only for the limited, albeit great, purposes of teaching and research. But according to the Calvin report, a university cannot take collective action on what it calls the issues of the day, as that would be antithetical to its basic purpose. And I quote, "There is no mechanism by which it can reach a collective position without inhibiting that full freedom of dissent on which it thrives. The neutrality of the university as an institution arises then not from a lack of courage, nor out of indifference and insensitivity." So, can a university committed to certain values purport to be neutral in this way? It's worth noting that even the advocates of institutional neutrality within the academy themselves are very quick to highlight that they don't believe a university must be neutral about its mission or about its values of free inquiry. But if that is the case, a university must surely then be prepared to take a substantive position on certain social and political issues, even those that are issues of the day, when they concern its mission and values. For example, must a university not be able to take a position on public issues where it implicates its teaching, learning, and research, or where it implicates its budget, or where it involves an activity accepted as part of the university's obligations? Or what if an issue implicates the very constitution of democracy and the civic order of which the university is a part? You might say it is not necessarily clear where the line is drawn between institutional neutrality and institutional position-taking in such circumstances. Indeed, there may even be those sympathetic to the general idea of institutional neutrality who would accede that it should be overridden or suspended on matters that affect the very foundations of our society, or which may destroy the theoretical foundations for institutional neutrality. To paraphrase Karl Popper's liberal formulation of not being tolerant of intolerance, you can't, as it were, be neutral about threats to neutrality. And if, as some have argued, there is fundamental alignment between free speech and EDI, between the epistemic and the civic missions of a university, would that not mean that you would need to be robust in your position in responding to threats to EDI in the same way that you'd respond to threats to free speech and academic freedom? That is perhaps a long way, very long way, of saying that the idea of institutional neutrality seems only to take us so far. As it concerns EDI, though, there does seem to be merit, at least I would argue, in the basic propositions that universities, in considering how they express their stance on EDI and EDI-related matters, should take care to frame as much as possible their interventions in ways that can be justified according to the civic and educative missions that animate the modern university. At a time of polarisation, it seems to be a more challenge urgent than ever for those of us who care about our responsibility to create social impact, to be thinking within the university world about the social licence that we have to operate.
All right, colleagues. Tim and I will reflect with you for the next half an hour, and lots of takeaways. I'm sure you were busy writing lots of things down: free speech, academic freedom, institutional advocacy, institutional neutrality, culture wars. Has EDI run out of steam? Has EDI gone wrong? EDI excess, institutional black victimhood, and the whole data set around the British public opinion survey. 62% of the British public thinks that EDI is a good thing. And 46% thinks that EDI can lead to fair outcomes. So something to be consoled about. I believe there will be a Slido poll or something, so people might want to send their questions as well that way, and we will bring them up on the screen here, and Tim can respond. But are there any questions, comments, reflections, any feedback, colleagues? Right here, colleague here.
Hi, I was particularly interested in several conflations that seem to happen in these conversations around the relationship with EDI and free speech, particularly that we conflate all freedoms within a free speech model rather than thinking, for example, about freedom of association and how that conflicts with free speech. I'm thinking particularly around Policy Exchange's report about gender-critical feminists being a bit sad that no one needed to eat lunch with them, and that was one of the reasons that we needed the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, for example. But also the conflation of the institution and the individual in terms of responsibility for neutrality, but also responsibility for any civic or epistemic mission. So I just wondered if you had any reflections on those particular conflations.
Thank you. We framed our research primarily in terms of speech, not in terms of freedom of association, but you rightly highlight how association can enter into many of these conversations, and it does indeed come through complaints that you hear about shunning or ostracization. So I think it's a very fertile question to explore, in fact, to explore how notions of association do shape the discourse around freedom of speech. I suspect that it's latent or implicit, or it's sometimes mislabeled, as you've rightly highlighted. So I think I'd like to take this back to my colleagues and explore it in potential future iterations. I mean, the language of freedom, I think, is inevitably contested. That so much is obvious. What we're arguing for in this research is for a reevaluation of how we depict contests that relate to diversity and equality and freedom, and to understand that there may be greater consensus, or at least in sentiment, there is greater convergence of sentiment around matters of EDI than is given credit for within public discourse. If we can dial down some of the public debate and have a more temperate debate, then perhaps some of the nuances that you've highlighted may come through in analysis and discussion more clearly.
Thank you. Another question here, and if you could just say who you are, please.
I'm Kramat Iqbal. I'm a child of the 70s. On my first day at school, I was told they did not want any more fucking packies in the school. And later, because of that and other incidents, I became an equalities practitioner, race equality specifically. In the 70s in the UK, we had race equality, Commission for Racial Equality. Later, that got merged into a broader Equality and Human Rights Commission, and a watering down of race would you agree with me that with the racist riots that we've had recently, that we need to go back to a time with a particular focus, not just on equality within diversity, but race equality in a particular way?
I mean, I have a history myself working on race issues, but in the Australian context, where I was Race Discrimination Commissioner for 5 years, and I'm certainly of the firm view that if you can't name a problem, you can't then solve it. Racism exists, and it should be addressed. And if you don't call it for what it is, you can end up then creating problems down the track. I've been struck by the response to the riots here in the UK. I think the Starmer Labor government deserves credit for having a relatively swift response to it. But I note that in recent discussions about the riots, the Prime Minister here has talked about how delivering on policy will solve the problems associated with far-right extremism. I think that only gets us part of the way there, because you need to recognise that if there's a problem with racist extremism, we need to deal with that and not think that a rising tide will lift all boats and will cure racism in the process. So insofar as you need to be explicit about certain social ills when they do emerge, I agree that it is important to call out racism when it occurs, and the riots that occurred this summer did exhibit very clear signs of racism and bigotry. So in calling out far-right extremism, I hope that our policy and governmental leaders here are also prepared to be explicit about how that involves racism, bigotry, and not just some amorphous, disillusioned form of activity that is just far right but is left at that.
Thank you. Some questions coming through on Slido. Tim?
Sharon Lynch says, why don't presenters on EDI call it what it is, a genocide? Yeah, I'm not sure if you're referring to a particular event or if you're referring to EDI as a form of replacing white people. I mean, I'm sorry, that's an ambiguous question, and I'm not trying to be flippant here, so I don't know how to respond to that. Should we talk about equality or equity or both? I think we can talk about both. We talk about equality, I talk about equality in the UK context, because we have a legislative anchor for institutional efforts relating to diversity and inclusion called the Equality Act. It's not called the Equity Act. And I think if you're not prepared to use legislation that you have, you should be prepared to lose it. So if you believe that public sector equality duties are a good thing, if you believe that having protections against discrimination is a good thing and exists in the Equality Act, then talking about equality is not a bad thing and is not a position of weakness. And if you want to talk philosophically about questions of equity, you can talk about formal equality, the idea of having just equal opportunity, and you can talk about substantive equality as well, which in many respects resembles the concerns that people raise under the umbrella of equity. I find that many of the terminological debates that we have around equality and equity just deeply frustrating when we are in many respects talking about the same thing and we're just doing it in the context of particular histories and particular pieces of legislation which do mean something. At least I believe they do. So I hope that gives a clear answer to that. Anonymous says, you call for diversity of thought at universities, but also acknowledge exposure to such can be very hurtful. How do we support our higher education students with this? I don't think it's easy. I think we need to ensure that students within universities are prepared to encounter views with which they disagree and to feel challenged, but they should not feel physically unsafe or threatened. I mean, I do think going to university should unsettle you in some way, intellectually. Intellectual discomfort and being unsettled intellectually is a good thing. If we don't believe that it's a good thing, then we shouldn't have universities, frankly. But it's where it crosses the line into something that can distort, or something that can threaten, or something that gets in the way of others exercising their freedoms, that we then need to take concern. Now, drawing that distinction or that division isn't necessarily simple, and sometimes you may not get it right. Sometimes things will change over time as well. So what begins as psychic or psychological dissettling can then turn into something more physical over time. But I would say that the default must surely be to understand the value of freedom of inquiry, freedom of speech. But again, that is not something mutually exclusive to a commitment to equality and to caring about students and indeed staff in universities when they encounter views that cross the line into something that is discriminatory or unacceptable.
Thank you. Any other questions or reflections, colleagues? One question up here.
Hi, Shrihan Lynch. It was me that asked the question around why can't we just call it a genocide, because that's what it is. And I was referring to Gaza, and I find it deeply problematic, first of all, that we have started this Bureau conference and we haven't had a moment's silence. We haven't acknowledged what's happening. Instead, we were told to leave the geopolitical context to one side and forget about what was going on whilst we come into this space. As a Palestinian, I find that deeply, deeply unsettling. But the reason why I'm asking you this is because your 10th recommendation was around knowing when to intervene. So I want to know, as the person presenting today, the keynote speaker on EDI, and I'm also extending this to BERA as an organisation, when will we intervene? When will the statements come out of solidarity? Because we're at 41,000 people murdered. So is it going to happen at 50? Or 60, or 70, or when's it going to happen? So when are we going to intervene? Thank you.
Well, I'll observe the limits of my ability to intervene here with BERA. I'll leave BERA to speak for themselves. I can only speak for myself. You know, we live in a democracy, and we live in democracies, and I think democracies need to speak, and they speak through the people that we elect to govern us. That is primarily how we resolve political issues and political disagreements and debates. I think everyone observes human suffering with compassion, but we shouldn't be rushing to condemn people for not being able to change the world when governments don't act or change. So I think on this issue, there is room for passion, room for disagreement, but I suspect that I won't be giving you an answer you'll be pleased with or be entirely satisfied with. But I wouldn't say that you should be judging me then for not having feeling or compassion for the suffering of others. I think you can have a range of dispositions, orientations to how you use your voice and your institutional advocacy, and you know, the conversation should continue.
question up here, and then one up here. And
Diolch yn iawn. I'm a cyflwyniad. Thank you for the presentation. I was going to ask you, my name is Matthew Evans, I'm from Cardiff in Wales. I just wanted to ask you a question about, you know, the public attitude survey, which you've, and then the 7 different groups, which I think are very interesting. Isn't that a very positive picture of what, you know, British attitudes are regarding this point? And it's surprising, given your initial comments about America and that divided. You know, it doesn't seem that there's a correlation between the American, where you started, and the British context, which you finished with. And I'm not an expert in this field, as you probably understand and hear now, but surely those responses are quite strange, because those groups wouldn't agree on a whole host of other things, would they? Is there a question there? I'm not sure.
No. I think that's kind of the point. That is kind of the point, that in so many conversations we have about diversity, we hear what's happening in America, we see what's happening in America, and we assume that it's playing out here. And we have a debate that plays out without fidelity to facts and evidence about the British experience and context. So the desire of this research, and one reason why I've juxtaposed the American experience with the British experience, is just to highlight what I find a strange dissonance. The UK is not the US, and you know, people have written books recently about this, called Almost That, and I think the desire behind provoking you with that juxtaposition was to make you think about some of the nuances in conversations and debates that don't always get surfaced within major political and media commentaries about diversity.
thank you.
Hi, my name is Chris Holligan. I found just a few points. I found your response to that colleague about Gaza quite problematical, to say the least. Would it be a case for arguing that you can have a right-wing and a left-winged EDI? Oxford University has taken some professors to court recently because the professors fought Oxford University on age-related retirement policies. How do you stand on them? In the case of 1 or 2 professors, they defeated Oxford University on being forced to retire from their jobs because of the chronological age. I mean, is Oxford going to give that up? I know Cambridge is involved in that game as well. I mean, what's going on? I mean, is the positionality of Oxford in this British class structure not problematic for EDI?
Of course it creates a challenge for us. I mean, we're a 900-year-old institution. We have a certain history and baggage. And you'd be foolish not to think that history matters to some degree. But we have made significant strides. There's still a long way for us to go, and we certainly don't shy away from issues or from disagreement on certain matters. On the EJRA, that is something that has been contentious ever since it was introduced and devised. We have that stance while observing our obligations to equality law, but there have been contests about it, and I'm sure there will be contests about it again in future, and we're not the only institution that does this, but we've taken that position through our sovereign body congregation because we believe that there is an imperative for us to consider the diversity of our workforce, and it's an appropriate measure in the view of congregation to have a certain retirement age to allow for more diversity to come into our workforce. So in that respect, it is an EDI stance and policy, and we've articulated that very clearly.
There was another question here. Thank you.
Hi Tim, thanks for your speech, it was really inspiring. It's Nazreen from the Institute of Education at UCL. My question is around the recent riots and the fact that a large percentage of the individuals who took part in the riots were young people of school age. You know, quite a significant number were primary and majority secondary age. So what are your thoughts on policy makers, and what kind of messages would you want to give policy makers in order to do work in schools, in order to build those bridges and actually, you know, develop better conversations around this area?
Yeah, I think having interventions and conversations and community-based reflections on this is going to be critical. That's got to go hand in hand too with a national response. So I definitely see this as a challenge, not just to communities where riots did break out in very particular locales, but also to national policy, and this links up to the question from our colleague earlier about whether we need to call out racism directly. I would say that there is a clear moment to be considering whether there needs to be more systematic responses to racism at a local and national level, but there's also got to be further work done in building bridges between different groups within local communities. There's a third element too, I should add to all this, which is going to be very difficult to wrestle with, and that's the digital element. The role of social media in mobilizing protests. I think you could have impeccable community-based solutions which may only go so far to addressing the digital elements that, you know, it's like wrestling with smoke, isn't it? You cannot pin it down because it's there online in cyberspace. So that has to be something that governments and policymakers need to think hard about. But I'd add too, we can't just delegate this problem to governments. There's a real need for civil society and for families to take a response and responsibility on this as well. So I'm in a lecture theatre with colleagues, many of whom are, I'm sure, conducting research that will help shed light on this and help point to ways that we can emerge from the current situation with at least hope that the riots we saw this summer won't happen again.
Thank you. Tim, should we take a couple more from the slider? We have 3 minutes. If we could take two questions.
Sure, or I'll do my best to get through them. Should EDI race equality be integral to all activity in education institutions rather than housed in separated, precarious, temporary roles? This is from Penny Rabager. Sorry if I've mispronounced your name. Well, I think the work of EDI should be integral in educational institutions, particularly higher education, for the reasons that I outlined. I think there's a separation or distinction you can make between having a policy and program response and how that's staffed. So I note the questions really getting at the need for sustained commitment to EDI interventions, and I think that's a real challenge. But you know, having a permanent job in any industry these days is an increasingly rare thing. Joe Billington asks, interested in your thoughts on inequality in the EDI discourse. For example, disability rarely features. Are some representations of diversity more valuable than others? I certainly agree that disability doesn't have the same profile as other dimensions of diversity. We're just finalising work at Oxford in having a collegiate university approach to EDI. We've highlighted disability and socioeconomic status as two areas that have been under that we haven't paid attention to in the way that we would like in future. So I definitely agree that there's more that can be done on disability inclusion.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, colleagues. Lots to take away this afternoon, and I suppose the final thing is about considering our own activism, or our own sense of neutrality, and our own institutions' activism and or neutrality. Colleagues, just join me once again in thanking Tim for a fascinating